Chapter 29. The Will. The activities of the will comprise the third great class of mental processes. Psychologists always have differed greatly in their conception of just what constitutes these activities. Even today it is difficult to obtain a dictionary definition of the will that agrees with the best opinion on the subject. The dictionaries adhere to the old classification and conception which regarded the will as that faculty of the mind or soul by which it chooses or decides. But with the growth of the idea that the will acts according to the strongest motive, and that the motive is supplied by the average struck between the desires of the moment under the supervision of the intellect, the conception of will as the choosing and deciding faculty is passing from favour. In place of the older conception has come the newer one, which holds that the will is primarily concerned with action. It is difficult to place the will in the category of mental processes, but it is generally agreed that it abides in the very centre of the mental being, and is closely associated with what is called the ego, or self. The will seems to have at least three general phases. Those are 1. The phase of action, 2. The phase of deliberation or choice, and 3. The phase of expression in action. In order to understand the will, it is necessary to consider each of these three phases of its activities. 1. Desire. The first phase of will, which is called desire, is in itself somewhat complex. On its lower side it touches, and in fact blends into, feeling and emotion. Its centre consists of a state of tension akin to that of a coiled spring or a cat crouching ready for a spring. On its higher side it touches, penetrates, and blends into the other phases of the will which we have mentioned. Desire is defined as a feeling, emotion, or excitement of the mind directed toward the attainment, enjoyment, or possession of some object from which pleasure, profit, or gratification is expected. Halleck gives us the following excellent conception of the moving spirit of desire. Desire has for its object something which will bring pleasure or get rid of pain, immediate or remote, for the individual or for someone in whom he is interested. Aversion, or a striving away from something, is merely the negative aspect of desire. In Halleck's statement, above quoted, we have the explanation of the part played by the intellect in the activities of will. The intellect is able to perceive the relations between present action and future results, and is able to point the way toward the suppression of some desires in order that other and better ones may be manifested. It also serves its purposes in regulating the striking of the average between conflicting desires. Without the intervention of the intellect, the temporary desire of the moment would be invariably acted upon without regard to future results or consequences to oneself and others. It also serves to point out the course of action calculated to give the most satisfactory expression of the desire. While it is a fact that the action of will depends almost entirely upon the motive force of desire, it is likewise true that desire may be created, regulated, suppressed, or even killed by the action of the will. The will, by giving or refusing attention to a certain class of desires, may either cause them to grow and wax strong, or else die and fade away. It must be remembered, however, that this use of the will itself springs from another set of desires or feelings. Desire is aroused by feelings or emotions rising from the subconscious planes of the mind and seeking expression and manifestation. We have considered the nature of the feelings and emotions in previous chapters, which should be read in connection with the present one. It should be remembered that the feeling or emotional side of desire arises from either inherited race memories existing as instincts, or from the memory of the past experiences of the individual. In some cases the feeling first manifests in a vague unrest caused by subconscious promptings and excitement. Then the imagination pictures the object of the feeling, or certain memory images connected with it, and the desire thus manifests on the plane of consciousness. The entrance of the desire feeling into consciousness is accompanied by that peculiar tension which marks the second phase of desire. This tension, when sufficiently strong, passes into the third phase of desire, or that in which desire blends into will action. Desire, in this stage, makes a demand upon will for expression and action. From mere feeling and tension of feeling, it becomes a call to action. But before expression and action are given to it, the second phase of will must manifest, at least for a moment. This second phase is that known as deliberation, or the weighing and balancing of desires. 2. Deliberation. The second phase of will, known as deliberation, is more than the purely intellectual process which the term would indicate. The intellect plays an important part, it is true, but there is also an almost instinctive and automatic weighing and balancing of desires. There is seldom only one desire presenting its claims upon the will at any particular moment. It is true that occasionally there arises an emotional desire of such dominant power and strength that it crowds out every other claimant at the bar of deliberation. But such instances are rare, and as a rule there are a host of rival claimants, each insisting upon its rights in the matter at issue. In the man of weak or undeveloped and untrained intellect, the struggle is usually little more than a brief combat between several desires, in which the strongest at the moment wins. But with the development of intellect, new factors arise, and new forces are felt. Moreover, the more complex one's emotional nature, and the greater the development of the higher forms of feeling, the more intense is the struggle of deliberation, or the fight of the desires. We see, in Halleck's definition, that desire has not only the object of bringing pleasure or getting rid of pain for the individual, but that the additional element of the welfare of someone in whom he is interested is added, which element is often the deciding factor. This element, of course, arises from the development and cultivation of one's emotional nature. In the same way, we also see that it is not merely the intermediate welfare of oneself, or those in whom one is interested, that speaks before the bar, but also the more remote welfare. This consideration of future welfare depends upon the intellect and cultivated imagination under its control. Moreover, the trained intellect is able to discover possible greater satisfaction in some course of action other than in the one prompted by the clamouring desire of the moment. This explains why the judgment and action of an intelligent man, as a rule, are far different from those of the unintelligent one, and also why a man of culture tends toward different action from that of the uncultured, and likewise why the man of broad sympathies and high ideals acts in a different way from one of the opposite type. But the principle is ever the same. The feelings manifest in desire. The greatest ultimate satisfaction apparent at the moment is sought, and the strongest set of desires wins the day. Halleck's comment on this point is interesting. He says, "Desire is not always proportional to the idea of one's own selfish pleasure. Many persons, after forming an idea of the vast amount of earthly distress, desire to relieve it, and the desire goes out in action, as the benevolent societies in every city testify. Here the individual pleasure is none the less, but it is secondary, coming from the pleasure of others. The desire of the near often raises a stronger desire than the remote. A child frequently prefers a thing immediately if it is only 1/10 as good as something he might have a year hence. A student often desires more the leisure of today than the success of future years. Though admonished to study, he wastes his time, and thus loses incomparably greater pleasure when he is tossed to the rear in the struggle for existence." The result of this weighing and balancing of the desire is, or should be, decision and choice, which then passes into action. But many persons seem unable to make up their own mind, and require a push or urge from without before they will act. Others decide, without proper use of the intellect, upon what they call impulse, but which is merely impatience. Some are like the fabled donkey, which starved to death when placed at an equal distance between two equally attractive haystacks, and was unable to decide towards which to move. Others follow the example of Jep in the comedy, who, when given a coin with which to buy a piece of soap for his wife, stood on the corner deliberating whether to obey orders or to buy a drink with the money. He wants the drink, but realizes that his wife will beat him if he returns without the soap. "My stomach says drink, my back says soap," says Jep. But finally he remarks, "Is not a man's stomach more to him than his back?" "Yes," says I. The final decision depends upon the striking a balance between the desires, the weighing of desire for and desire against, desire for this or desire for something else. The strength of the several desires depends upon nearness and present interest arising from attention, as applied to the feelings and emotions arising from heredity, environment, experience, and education, which constitute character, and also upon the degree of intellectual clearness and power in forming correct judgments between the desires. It must be remembered, however, that the intellect appears not as an opponent of the principle of the satisfaction of desire, but merely as an instrument of the ego in determining which course of action will result in the greatest ultimate satisfaction, direct or indirect, present or future. For, at the last, every individual acts so as to bring himself the greatest satisfaction, immediate or future, direct or indirect, either personal or through the welfare of others, as this may appear to him at the particular moment of deliberation. We always act in the direction of that which will greater content our spirit. This will be found to be the spirit of all decisions, although the motive is often hidden and difficult to find even by the individual himself, many of the strongest motives having their origin in the subconscious planes of mentality. 3. Action. The third and final phase of will is that known as action, the act of volition by which the desire idea is expressed in physical or mental activity. The old conception of the will held that the decisive phase of the will was its characteristic and final phase, ignoring the fact that the very essence or spirit of will is bound up with action. Even those familiar with the newer conception frequently assume that the act of decision is the final phase of will, ignoring the fact that we frequently decide to do a thing and yet may never carry out the intention and decision. The act of willing is not complete unless action is expressed. There must be the manifestation of the motor element or phase of will, else the will process is incomplete. A weakness of this last phase of will affects the entire will and renders its processes ineffective. The world is filled with persons who are able to decide what is best to do and what should be done, but who never actually act upon the decision. The few persons who promptly follow up the decision with vigorous action are those who accomplish the world's work. Without the full manifestation of this third phase of will, the other two phases are useless. Types of will. So far we have considered merely the highest type of will, that which is accompanied by conscious deliberation, in which the intellect takes an active part. In this process, not only do the conflicting feelings push themselves forward with opposing claims for recognition, but the intellect is active in examining the case and offering valuable testimony as to the comparative merits of the various claimants and the effect of certain courses of action upon the individual. There are, however, several lower forms of will manifestation which we should briefly consider in passing. Reflex action. The will is moved to action by the reflex activities of the nervous system which have been mentioned in the earlier chapters of this book. In this general type we find unconscious reflex action, such as that manifested when a sleeper is touched and moves away, or when a frog's leg twitches when the nerve end is excited. We also find conscious reflex action, such as that manifested by the winking of the eye, or the performance of habitual physical motion, such as the movement in walking, operating the sewing machine or typewriter, playing the piano, etc. Impulsive action. The will is often moved to action by a dim idea or vague perception of purpose or impulse. The action is almost instinctive, although there is a vague perception of purpose. For instance, we feel an impulse to turn toward the source of a strange sound or sight, or other source of interest or curiosity. Or we may feel an impulse arising from the subconscious plane of our mind, causing a dimly conscious idea of movement or action to relieve the tension. For instance, one may feel a desire to exercise, or to seek fresh air or green fields, although he had not been thinking of these things at the time. These impulses arise from a subconscious feeling of fatigue or desire for change, which, added to a fleeting idea, produces the impulse. Unless an impulse is inhibited by the will activities inspired by other desires, habits, ideas, or ideals, we act upon it in precisely the same way that a young child or animal does. Hofting says of this type of action, "The psychological condition of the impulse is that with the momentary feeling and sensation should be combined a more or less clear idea of something which may augment the pleasure or diminish the pain of the moment." Instinctive action. The will is frequently moved to action by an instinctive stimulus. This form of will activity closely resembles the last mentioned form, and often it is impossible to distinguish between the two. The activities of the bee in building its comb and storing its honey, the work of the silkworm and caterpillar in building their resting places, are examples of this form of action. Indeed, even the building of the nest of the bird may be so classed. In these cases there is an intelligent action toward a definite end, but the animal is unconscious of that end. The experiences of the remote ancestors of these creatures recorded their impressions upon the subconscious mind of the species, and they are transmitted in some way to all of that species. The nervous system of every living thing is a record cylinder of the experiences of its early ancestors, and these cylinders tend to reproduce these impressions upon appropriate occasions. In preceding chapters we have shown that even man is under the influence of instinct to a greater extent than he imagines himself to be. End of chapter 29. End of section 13. Chapter 30. Will Training. It is of the utmost importance that the individual develop, cultivate, and train his will so as to bring it under the influence of the higher part of his mental and moral being. While the will is used most effectively in developing and training the intellect and building character, it itself must be trained by itself to habitually come under the guidance of the intellect and under the influence of that which we call character. The influence of the trained will upon the several mental faculties is most marked. There are no faculties which may not be cultivated by the will. The first and great task of the will in this direction is the control and direction of the attention. The will determines the kind of interest that shall prevail at the moment, and the kind of interest largely determines the character of the man, his tastes, his feelings, his thoughts, his acts. Gordy says, "Co-operating with a pre-existing influence, the will can make a weaker one prevail over a stronger. It determines which of pre-existing influences shall have control over the mind." Moreover, concentrated and continued attention depends entirely upon the exercise of the will. As Gordy says, "If the will relaxes its hold upon the activities of the mind, The attention is liable to be carried away by any one of the thousands of ideas that the laws of association are constantly bringing into our minds. Even in the matter of mental images, the will asserts its sway, and the imagination may be trained to be the obedient servant of the developed will. Regarding the influence of the will upon character, Davidson says, "It is not enough for a man to understand correctly and love duly the conditions of moral life in his own time. He must, still further, be willing and able to fulfil these conditions. And he certainly cannot do this unless his will is trained to perfect freedom, so that it responds, with the utmost readiness, to the suggestions of his discriminating intelligence and the movements of his chastened affections." Halleck says, "We gradually make our characters by separate acts of will, just as a blacksmith, by repeated blows, beats out a horseshoe or an anchor from a shapeless mass of iron. A finished anchor or horseshoe was never the product of a single blow." Training the will. Perhaps the best way to train the will is to use it intelligently and with a purpose. The training of any faculty of the mind is at the same time a training of the will. The attention being so closely allied to the will, it follows that a careful training of attention will result in a strengthening of the will. The training of the emotional side of one's nature also brings results in the strengthening of the will. Halleck gives his students excellent advice regarding the training of the will. It would be hard to find anything better along these lines than the following from his pen: "Nothing schools the will and renders it ready for effort in this complex world better than accustoming it to face disagreeable things. Professor James advises all to do something occasionally for no other reason than that they would rather not do it, if it is nothing more than giving up a seat in a street car. He likens such effort to the insurance that a man pays on his house. He has something that he can fall back on in time of trouble. A will schooled in this way is always ready to respond, no matter how great the emergency. While another would be crying over spilled milk, the possessor of such a will has already found another cow. The only way to secure such a will is to practice doing disagreeable things. There are daily opportunities." A man who had declared his aversion to what he deemed the dry facts of political economy was one day found knitting his brow over a chapter of John Stuart Mill. When a friend expressed surprise, the man replied, "I am playing the schoolmaster with myself. I am reading this book because I dislike it." Such a man has the elements of success in him. On the other hand, the one who habitually avoids disagreeable action is training his will to be of no use to him at a time when supreme effort is demanded. Such a will can never elbow its way to the front in life. Habits. Habits are the beaten track over which the will travels. The beaten path of habit is the line of least resistance to the will. One who would train his will must needs pay attention to providing it with the proper mental paths over which to travel. The rule for the creation of habits is simply this: travel over the mental path as often as possible. The rule for breaking undesirable habits is this: cultivate the opposite habit. In these two rules is expressed the gist of what has been written on the subject. Professor William James has left to the world some invaluable advice regarding the cultivation of right habits. He bases his rules upon those of Professor Bain, elaborates these, and adds some equally good ones. We herewith quote freely from both James and Bain on this subject. It is the best ever written regarding habit building. 1. In the acquisition of a new habit, or the leaving off of an old one, launch yourself with as strong and decided an initiative as possible. This will give your new beginning such a momentum that the temptation to break down will not occur as soon as it otherwise might, and every day during which a breakdown is postponed adds to the chances of it not occurring at all. James. 2. Never suffer an exception to occur till the new habit is securely rooted in your life. Every lapse is like the letting fall of a ball of string which one is carefully winding up. A single slip undoes more than a great many turns will wind again. James. It is necessary, above all things, in such a situation, never to lose a battle. Every gain on the wrong side undoes the effect of many conquests on the right. The essential precaution is so to regulate the two opposing powers that the one may have a series of uninterrupted successes until repetition has fortified it to such a degree as to enable it to cope with the opposition under any circumstances. Bain. 3. Seize the very first possible opportunity to act on every resolution you make, and on every emotional prompting you may experience in the direction of the habits you aspire to gain. It is not in the moment of their forming, but in the moment of their producing motor effects, that resolves and aspirations communicate their new set to the brain. James. The actual presence of the practical opportunity alone furnishes the fulcrum upon which the lever can rest, by which the moral will may multiply its strength and raise itself aloft. He who has no solid ground to press against will never get beyond the stage of empty gesture-making. Bain. 4. Keep the faculty alive in you by a little gratuitous exercise every day. That is, be systematically ascetic or heroic in little unnecessary points. Do every day something for no other reason than that you would rather not do it, so that when the hour of dire need draws nigh, it may find you not unnerved and untrained to stand the test. The man who has daily inured himself to habits of concentrated attention, energetic volition, and self-denial in unnecessary things, will stand like a tower when everything rocks around him, and when his softer fellow-mortals are winnowed like chaff in the blast. James. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31. Will Tonic. In addition to the general rules for developing and training the will given in the preceding chapter, we ask you to tone up and strengthen the will by the inspiration to be derived from the words of some of the world's great thinkers and doers. In these words there is such a vital statement of the recognition, realization, and manifestation of that something within which we call will, that it is a dull soul, indeed, which is not inspired by the contagion of the idea. These expressions are the milestones on the path of attainment, placed by those who have preceded us on the journey. We submit these quotations without comment. They speak for themselves. Words of the wise. They can who think they can. Character is a perfectly educated will. Nothing can resist the will of a man who knows what is true and wills what is good. In all difficulties advance and will, for within you is a power, a living force, which the more you trust and learn to use will annihilate the opposition of matter. The star of the unconquered will, it rises in my breast, serene and resolute and still, and calm and self-possessed. So nigh is grandeur to our dust, so near is God to man, when duty whispers low, thou must. The youth replies, I can. The longer I live, the more certain I am that the great difference between men, between the feeble and the powerful, the great and the insignificant, is energy, invincible determination, a purpose once fixed, then death or victory. That quality will do anything that can be done in this world, and no talents, no circumstances, no opportunities will make a two-legged creature a man without it. Buxton. The human will, that force unseen, the offspring of a deathless soul, can hew a way to any goal, though walls of granite intervene. You will be what you will to be. Let failure find its false content in that poor word, environment. But spirit scorns it and is free. It masters time, it conquers space, it cowes that boastful trickster chance, and bids the tyrant circumstance uncrown and fill a servant's place. Resolve is what makes a man manifest, not puny resolve, not crude determinations, not errant purpose, but that strong and indefatigable will which treads down difficulties and danger as a boy treads down the heaving frostlands of winter, which kindles his eye and brain with a proud pulse beat toward the unattainable. Will makes men giants. Donald G. Mitchell. There is no chance, no destiny, no fate can circumvent or hinder or control the firm resolve of a determined soul. Gifts count for nothing. Will alone is great. All things give way before it, soon or late. What obstacle can stay the mighty force of the sea-seeking river in its course, or cause the ascending orb of day to wait? Each well-born soul must win what it deserves. Let the fools prate of luck. The fortunate is he whose earnest purpose never swerves, whose slightest action or inaction serves the one great aim. Why, even death itself stands still and waits an hour sometimes for such a will. Ella Wheeler Wilcox. I have brought myself, by long meditation, to the conviction that a human being with a settled purpose must accomplish it, and that nothing can resist a will which will stake even existence upon its fulfilment. Lord Beaconsfield. A passionate desire and an unwearied will can perform impossibilities, or what may seem to be such to the cold and feeble. Sir John Simpson. It is wonderful how even the casualties of life seem to bow to a spirit that will not bow to them, and yield to subserve a design which they may, in their first apparent tendency, threaten to frustrate. When a firm, decisive spirit is recognised, it is curious to see how the space clears around a man and leaves him room and freedom. John Foster. The great thing about General Grant is cool persistency of purpose. He is not easily excited, and he has got the grip of a bulldog. When he once gets his teeth in, nothing can shake him off. Abraham Lincoln. I am bigger than anything that can happen to me. All these things are outside my door, and I've got the key. Man was meant to be, and ought to be, stronger and more than anything that can happen to him. Circumstances, fate, luck, are all outside, and if he cannot change them, he can always beat them. Charles F. Lummis. The truest wisdom is a resolute determination. Impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools. Circumstances. I make circumstances. Napoleon. He who fails only half wills. Saguaro. That which the easiest becomes a habit in us is the will. Learn then to will strongly and decisively. Thus fix your floating life, and leave it no longer to be carried hither and thither like a withered leaf by every wind that blows. Man owes his growth chiefly to that active striving of the will, that encounter which we call effort, and it is astonishing to find how often results apparently impracticable are thus made possible. It is will, force of purpose, that enables a man to do or be whatever he sets his mind upon being or doing. A strong defiant purpose is many-handed and lays hold of whatever is near that can serve it. It has a magnetic purpose that draws to itself whatever is kindred. Let it be your first study to teach the world that you are not wood and straw, that there is some iron in you. Munger. It's dogged as does it. Yorkshire proverb. One talent with a will behind it will accomplish more than 10 without it, as a thimbleful of powder in a rifle, the bore of whose barrel will give it direction, will do greater execution than a carload burned in the open air. O. S. Marden. Will may not endow a man with talents or capacities, but it does one very important matter. It enables him to make the best, the very best, of his powers. Fothergill. Tender-handed, stroke a nettle, and it stings you for your pains. Grasp it like a man of metal, and it soft as down remains. Don't flinch, don't foul, but hit the line hard. Roosevelt. The more difficulties one has to encounter, within and without, the more significant and the higher in inspiration his life will be. End of chapter 31. End of Your Mind and How to Use It by William Walker Atkinson.